Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, I rise today to speak about a gross miscarriage of justice, the imprisonment of Mark Swidan by the government of China and the Chinese Communist Party. Mark is from Luling, a small city in my home state of Texas. His mother, Ms. Catherine Swidan, still lives in Luling, while Mark eventually became a resident of Houston, my hometown. For over 10 years, Catherine has been waging a desperate battle to see her son again. In 2012, Mark traveled to China on a business trip, which turned into a nightmare. On November 13th, 2012, Mark was abducted by China's Public Security Bureau while he was taking his family back home. A witness to the abduction has said that Mark was detained because Chinese officials wanted to view the contents of his cell phone. Mark was accused of being a part of a criminal conspiracy with 11 other individuals to manufacture and traffic drugs, charges that Mark has denied and which have been debunked over and over again. Chinese authorities tried to coerce Mark into confessing. He refused, and he pleaded not guilty in a trial that occurred in November 2013. During the trial, the prosecution didn't produce any forensic evidence to back up their allegations, and no drugs were found on Mark or in his hotel room. Records in Mark's passport show that he wasn't even in China during the time of the alleged offenses. And the 11 other individuals indicted in relation to this alleged drug conspiracy couldn't identify Mark. Nevertheless, outrageously, in 2019, a Chinese court sentenced Mark to death. Mark remains unjustly detained today. He is suffering in a Chinese prison right now as we speak. In prison, Mark has been kept in deplorable, abusive conditions. His jailers seek to break his will and break his faith. They have confiscated his Bible and his rosary. Mark's cell exposes him to extreme heat and extreme cold. He's deprived of sleep and subjected to physical abuse. He is in danger of high blood pressure, skin affections, and asthma. He's lost more than 100 pounds. His health is dire. Throughout all of this, Mark has been denied access to his family and access to American diplomats. Mark has communicated with his mother, and his mother has told me and told the world that the Chinese Communist government has failed to break Mark's faith, which remains strong. I spoke with Mark's mother earlier this week. This is a mom whose heart is breaking. This is a mom who wants to see her son again. This is a mom who wants to hold and hug and care for the son she loves. The treatment of Mark has been atrocious. So much so that even the United Nations has called on China to release him. The Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, a UN group of human rights experts who investigate cases of arbitrary detention around the world, found that Mark is being held in violation of customary international law and international norms, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The world can see that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to use hostages and hostage-taking as a tool of statecraft. The Chinese Communist Party says they want to be taken seriously as a great power and a great nation, and they say they want to be respected on the global stage. But their treatment of Mark is not how great nations and great powers behave. Their treatment of Mark is how third world despots act. Madam President, I have drafted and this week introduced a resolution calling on the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party to immediately release Mark. I'm joined by my colleague from Texas, Senator Cornyn, and by Representative Cloud from Texas in the House, who has introduced the same resolution in the House of Representatives. This resolution not only calls for Mark's immediate release, it also condemns China for withholding from Mark access to his family and to proper medical care. Furthermore, it calls upon the Biden administration to prioritize efforts to secure Mark's release, both in their conversation with Chinese diplomats and in international forums. In a few days, Secretary of State Blinken will be in Beijing, and he will have an opportunity to finish the final chapter of this tragedy. I'm calling on the Biden administration to use all of the tools at our disposal to secure Mark's release. And I'm calling on the government of China to finally release Mark. Madam President, this ordeal has got to end. It has to end for Mark. It has to end for his mother. It has to end for his family. We must and will do more so that Mark can come home. I yield the floor.
Without objection.
Mr. President, when the COVID pandemic hit, small businesses were shut down. Millions of Americans lost their jobs. Schools were shut down, flights were canceled, and traveling ground to a halt. The sick and the elderly were forced to die in hospitals and nursing homes, tragically alone, without the comforting embrace of loved ones. The corporate media told us there was no way that this virus could have escaped from a Chinese government lab. And big tech companies banned and censored posts laying out the evidence that it had escaped from a Chinese lab, labeling that evidence conspiracy theory. Masks were mandated everywhere. And when the COVID vaccines came out, those were mandated too. Doctors, nurses, and our brave servicemen and women who chose not to get the vaccine were fired, discharged, sent home. The corrupt corporate media's reaction to COVID devastated our economy and led directly to massive inflation, to weakening and even destroying faith in public health institutions, and resulted in learning loss that millions of American children may never recover from. The pandemic is over. President Biden has even admitted that. The vast majority of America has moved on with their lives. But sadly, the Biden White House and too many Senate Democrats want to cling to power. During the pandemic, we saw abuses of power at every level of government, but especially the federal government. Over the past 2 years, I've been proud to lead the fight in the Senate to stop these abuses by introducing targeted pieces of legislation that I've reintroduced in this new Congress. 5 of these bills would get rid of mandates. If passed into law, they would mean no more mask mandates, no vaccine mandates, no vaccine passports, no vaccine mandates for minors, and no vaccine mandates for kids to go back to school in Washington, D.C. 2 other bills concern vital health care. The Give Life Act, or DOS's bill, is named after a teenager in Texas who was denied a kidney transplant because he hadn't been vaccinated against COVID. Mr. President, no American should be denied a life-saving medical treatment such as an organ transplant because of their COVID vaccine status. That's wrong. Unfortunately, we have seen this kind of discrimination over and over again. We saw it happen to a teenager in Texas. It also happened to a 31-year-old man in Boston who was denied a heart transplant, to a 38-year-old veteran who had already had COVID twice, who was denied a kidney transplant in North Carolina. And a man in South Carolina was also denied a kidney transplant because he wasn't vaccinated against COVID. Just in December, yet another teenager was denied a kidney transplant, this time in North Carolina, because she wasn't vaccinated against COVID. The Give Life Act would stop the federal government from enabling this discrimination when it comes to organ donation. Another bill, the Ending Discrimination in COVID-19 Treatments Act, would mandate the Department of Health and Human Services to require that providers not engage in discriminatory practices when treating COVID. I filed this bill in response to reports that states across the country have used race and ethnicity as a factor in determining whether someone is eligible to receive COVID treatments, particularly monoclonal antibodies when they were first introduced. This bill now applies to all COVID funding and treatments, not just monoclonal antibodies. This kind of discrimination and treatment has happened in the past year. In January 2022, a man in New York who had both COVID and pneumonia was denied monoclonal antibodies. He told CBS News, quote, "The doctor just shut me down and said, this is the criteria. You're not of age, which is 65, and you're not a minority." As part of its response, the New York Department of Health told CBS, quote, "This guidance is based on CDC guidelines that show COVID mortality rates are higher among certain demographic groups, including senior citizens, immunocompromised individuals, and non-white Hispanic communities." So what New York said is they were following CDC guidelines in determining how this COVID treatment would be distributed. As New York itself admitted, the CDC guidelines are encouraging racial discrimination in the distribution of health care, and that's immoral and wrong. My bill would stop this discrimination. Let's be very clear here. Race, religion, ethnicity should not be a factor, 0, in determining anyone's medical treatment. Doing so is unconstitutional, it's wrong, and it's abhorrent. Mr. President, these are battles worth fighting. For those of us who have been standing up against these abusive mandates, we recently won a big victory in December of last year on COVID vaccines in the military. I have fought hard to end President Biden's military vaccine mandate. And last month, in December, we succeeded. We passed into law a provision to end the mandate, finally. But sadly, that provision was prospective. The Democrats in Congress would only agree to it going forward if it applied in the future but provided zero relief to the thousands or even tens of thousands of servicemen and women who were terminated because they declined to get the vaccine. To fix this, I've introduced legislation called the Americans Act, which would allow those servicemen and women who were terminated to be reinstated if they want to go back into the military. And if they do, they could go back to their original rank and receive the benefits to which they were entitled and which they have earned. If those service members choose not to go back in the military, my bill would ensure that they receive an honorable discharge, not merely a general discharge, as too many of them have received, which will ensure that they can receive the benefits they earned by fighting to defend this country. Mr. President, I'm committed to fighting for every soldier, every sailor, every airman, every Marine, every Coast Guardsman who was wrongfully terminated or wrongfully demoted because of the COVID vaccine mandate. And I give my word, I'm going to keep fighting for them until they see justice. That's why tonight we're going to be at the State of the Union address on the other side of the Capitol. And my guest tonight for the State of the Union is Lieutenant Levi Baird, a Naval Surface Warfare officer. Lieutenant Baird is a Texas resident and a top-rated officer. In March of 22, he faced a separation board because he made the personal decision to decline to get the COVID vaccine. But before the Biden administration could kick him out, a federal judge entered an injunction preventing the Navy from terminating Lieutenant Baird. However, the Navy is right now trying to recoup from him $75,000 that they already paid him in anticipation of Lieutenant Baird's becoming a department head, because he wasn't named a department head. Well, the reason he wasn't named a department head is because he made the personal decision not to get the COVID vaccine due to his own sincere religious objection. I'm proud to be welcoming Lieutenant Baird to the State of the Union tonight. I hope that his being there will cause those in the media to tell his story, because it really underscores how grotesquely unfair the Biden administration's policies have been and how they punish those American heroes. So Lieutenant Baird will be in the audience tonight, as Joe Biden, no doubt, will congratulate himself and try to avoid accountability for the problems his administration has caused. Mr. President, when it comes to COVID, the pandemic we endured as a nation was an enormous challenge. The policies that were put in place across this country in response to the pandemic, many of them have caused enormous damage. I believe as a nation we will look back on these policies in the years and decades to come and wonder what collective insanity came over this country. What insanity led to the judgment, it's a good idea to shut down schools for tens of millions of children across this country for more than a year? It's a good idea for young children, elementary school children, not to learn reading and writing and math. That policy has resulted in massive learning loss, and that learning loss has been all the greater among the economically disadvantaged, among Hispanic and African American kids. The result of these shutdowns is a generation of kids have been harmed, perhaps irreparably. In our military, the results of firing thousands upon thousands of servicemen and women, and we don't know how many. I would note I've asked the Biden administration over and over again, How many of our heroes have you fired? The administration refuses to answer. It is in the minimum thousands. It may be in the tens of thousands. But I can tell you, Mr. President, I've spoken with Navy SEALs, heroes who spent their lives training and defending this nation, and they're being fired. Some of the youngest, healthiest people we have in our country are being fired because they didn't comply with an arbitrary decree. And now, the President and administration have admitted that decree should no longer be in force. But the Navy SEALs they fired last year or the year before are still out of the military. All the while, we have massive recruiting shortfalls, and America's at greater jeopardy. You know, Mr. President, you're new on this side of the aisle, but not new to Congress. There was a time in this body when Republicans and Democrats could come together and reason together, where not everything we did was a shirts and skin partisan battle. Good morning, no, it's not. In less vituperative times, these shouldn't be difficult questions. When I forced a vote on the Senate floor that the D.C. public schools should not throw out of school every student who hasn't received the COVID vaccine, and mind you, that's 20% of the students in the D.C. public schools, and in the African American community, it's 40% of the African American students in the D.C. public schools. I'm sorry to say, when we voted on that in the Senate floor, every single Senate Democrat, all of them, voted to throw out of public schools 40% of the black kids in D.C. You're talking about a 13, 14, 15-year-old kid who Senate Democrats were willing to make a high school dropout involuntarily because that child or that child's parents made the decision not to receive the vaccine. In ordinary, sane times, that should be a 100-0 vote. You would think it was almost satirical that someone would stand up and say, we are debating whether or not to throw out of D.C. public schools 40% of the African American children. If you and I go home and talk to our citizens at home, to a person they would think that was nuts, unless they happen to work in this building. On the question of servicemen and women, we saw in the preceding year President Biden call to congratulate a Coast Guardsman who'd showed incredible heroism rescuing people at a time of natural disaster. That Coast Guardsman within the week was notified he was being terminated because he hadn't gotten the COVID vaccine. This shouldn't be divisive. We want our soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines and Coast Guardsmen to be ready, to be trained, to be serving. And if the administration agrees the mandate makes no sense today, why would we sit by and let thousands upon thousands of them remain fired, terminated, and denied the benefits they have earned? So, Mr. President, I call upon this body. Let's have a return to sanity. Let's fight for the men and women we are elected to represent. And I give you my word, I'm going to continue to fight against these mandates that are wrong, that are unjust, that are harmful. And I hope and pray this body can come together and embrace sanity once again. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Thank you. Clerk will call the roll.
The Ending Discrimination in COVID-19 Treatments Act would mandate the Department of Health and Human Services to require that providers not engage in discriminatory practices when treating COVID. I filed this bill in response to reports that states across the country have used race and ethnicity as a factor in determining whether someone is eligible to receive COVID treatments, particularly monoclonal antibodies when they were first introduced. This bill now applies to all COVID funding and treatments, not just monoclonal antibodies. This kind of discrimination and treatment has happened in the past year. In January 2022, a man in New York who had both COVID and pneumonia was denied monoclonal antibodies. He told CBS News, quote, "The doctor just shut me down and said, this is the criteria. You're not of age, which is 65, and you're not a minority." As part of its response, the New York Department of Health told CBS, quote, "This guidance is based on CDC guidelines that show COVID mortality rates are higher among certain demographic groups, including senior citizens, immunocompromised individuals, and non-white Hispanic communities." So what New York said is they were following CDC guidelines in determining how this COVID treatment would be distributed. As New York itself admitted, the CDC guidelines are encouraging racial discrimination in the distribution of health care, and that's immoral and wrong. My bill would stop this discrimination. Let's be very clear here. Race, religion, ethnicity should not be a factor, zero, in determining anyone's medical treatment. Doing so is unconstitutional, it's wrong, and it's abhorrent. Mr. President, these are battles worth fighting. Mr. President, today is Texas Independence Day. 187 years ago today, the Texians declared our independence from Mexico and fired a shot for liberty. In the fight for independence from Mexico, many would go on to give their lives for liberty. At the Alamo, including William Barrett Travis, Jim Bowie, and Davy Crockett. But shortly afterwards, after losing battle after battle after battle, the Texians won a decisive victory at the Battle of San Jacinto and formed the Republic of Texas. The rest is history. After 9 years as a republic, our own nation, Texas officially became part of the United States in February of 1846. Sam Houston, the founding father of the Lone Star State, was also born 230 years ago tomorrow. Tomorrow is Sam Houston's birthday. Happy birthday. Sam Houston was an extraordinary American. He was born in Virginia, spent many years in Tennessee, where he served in the U.S. House of Representatives and then became governor of Tennessee. In Texas, he served as commander-in-chief of the Texians Army. He led the Texas Army to victory in the War for Texas independence. When Texas became an independent nation, Sam Houston served in the Texas House of Representatives and then as president of the Republic of Texas. When Texas joined the United States, he served in the United States Senate and finally as governor of Texas. I've always been a bit sad that my colleague, Senator Cornyn, happens to occupy the seat that once was held by Sam Houston. Sam Houston was a tireless, talented leader and a great statesman who believed passionately in freedom. His words, "Govern wisely and as little as possible," remain true today, and the Lone Star State still follows that principle. These great heroes, these great Texians, risked everything for freedom to make freedom a reality for generations of Texans. Today, we celebrate and honor their sacrifices. Many years in the past, I've stood on the floor of the Senate and read Travis's letter from the Alamo to honor Texas Independence Day. This year, my colleague Senator Cornyn will read it, since I read it last year. I also want to take the time today to thank another group of Texans for their incredible sacrifices that they have made to the Lone Star State over the span of 200 years. The Texas Rangers. 2023 marks 200 years since Stephen F. Austin formed the Texas Rangers to protect people who had settled in Texas protect them from outlaws and hostile attacks. Over the years, the duties of the Texas Rangers expanded, and they played a key role in keeping Texas safe, from stopping an assassination attempt on President Taft to tracking down the infamous outlaws Bonnie and Clyde, to doing the hard, painstaking work to arrest the cult leader Warren Jeffs. The Rangers are critical to law and order in Texas, where rural counties often don't have the resources they need to investigate crime. The Rangers are always ready to step in and serve. There's an old line in the state of Texas: one riot, one Ranger. That's who the Texas Rangers are. Mr. President, I've been to the Texas Rangers Hall of Fame in Waco, Texas, where the Rangers have done a wonderful job of preserving artifacts and telling the story of the Rangers. Anyone stopping through Waco should visit it. The story of the Rangers is the story of Texas, and in many ways, the American West. It's a story about seeking freedom, and it's a story about courage. That's why today I'm proud to introduce a resolution honoring the bicentennial of the Texas Rangers, and in just a moment to propound a unanimous consent request in this body. I'm also proud to welcome here Major James Thomas to the Capitol. Major Thomas has served as a Ranger for 8 years, and he's the first Ranger to have a doctorate. Major Thomas, thank you for being here today, and thank you for your years of distinguished service to the great state of Texas. And to all of the Rangers, as we celebrate with you your 200th anniversary, congratulations, and thank you for your incredible service to Texas. And to every Texan, all 30 million, I wish you a very happy Texas Independence Day. Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of S-Res 86, which is at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 86, commemorating the bicentennial of the Texas Ranger Division.
Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, I rise today to honor the memory of Oswaldo Paya, who would have celebrated his 71st birthday this week. His memory and his story have been an inspiration to dissidents across the world, and I'd like to briefly retell it here today. Oswaldo Paya was a dissident and a democracy activist in Cuba with unrelenting passion and dedication. He was someone who stood up against the Castro regime at very direct risk to his own life. He had incredible courage. He spoke up for human rights. He spoke up for free speech. He spoke up for democracy. And 11 years ago, Oswaldo Paya was murdered. On July 22nd, 2012, Paya left his house with 3 other people to go visit friends. From the start of their journey, their car was followed. On the way, the Cuban police drove Paya's car off the road and killed him. The crash is widely believed to have been orchestrated by the Castro regime. Paya had long been a thorn in the side of the Castros, even from a young age. He was the only person at his school who had refused to join the communist youth. As a teenager, he publicly opposed the communist crackdown on protesters in Czechoslovakia who were fighting for freedom, and he was punished with 3 years in prison. Paya went on to found the Varela Project, which sought a referendum on Cuba's communist system. Their demands were simple: democratic government, religious liberty, freedom of expression, and the freedom to start businesses. Paya managed to get 11,000 signatures to petition the government to hold a referendum, and eventually 20,000 people supported the referendum. 20,000 people risked their lives by standing with Oswaldo Paya for freedom. But the Cuban government refused to hold a referendum. Paya's fight for freedom made him a target repeatedly of the Communist Party in Cuba. They harassed him, tried to intimidate him, and arrested him numerous times. And in 2012, they killed him. Paya's friend and the driver of the car said that when he awoke after the crash, he was confronted at the hospital by a government operative, and the hospital was flooded with uniformed military personnel. Under extreme duress, drugged, and threatened with death by government officials, he signed a confession that directly contradicted what he knew to be true, that the communist regime had just murdered Oswaldo Paya. I've met multiple times with Oswaldo Paya's daughter, Rosa Maria, who's an incredible, courageous, powerful leader in her own right. And we've discussed ways we can continue her father's fight for justice in Cuba. And one of the things I've done is I've filed legislation to rename the street in front of the Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C., Oswaldo Paya Way. Renaming the street in front of the Cuban embassy would send a powerful message to the communist regime. During the Cold War, President Reagan followed this very same strategy. He renamed the street in front of the Soviet embassy Sakharov Plaza after the famed human rights dissident in the Soviet Union. It was part of a broader strategy to call out the evil regime. My strategy is the same here. Some people may think a street name is not that big a deal. But think about it for a moment. If you change a street name, it means anyone who wants to write to the Cuban embassy will have to write Oswaldo Paya's name. Or if you need to go there, you'll have to look up the address and see the same. Tyranny exists in darkness. Oppressive regimes are terrified by dissidents. Members of the Cuban government who deal with the embassy will have to acknowledge that Paya existed and that this hero who was wrongfully murdered was real. They will have to say his name. There is power in saying his name. I want to tell you another story that illustrates just how powerful this renaming strategy can be. Several years ago, I introduced legislation to rename the street in front of the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C., Liu Xiaobo Plaza. Liu Xiaobo was a Nobel Peace Laureate and democracy activist in China who was wrongfully imprisoned there. My bill ended up passing the United States Senate 100-0. Every senator, Republican and Democrat, agreed with that bill. Sadly, even though it was a Democrat Senate at the time, the Republican House failed to take up the bill. So it didn't pass into law. But here's an epilogue to that story. The beginning of the Trump administration in 2017, I was having breakfast with Rex Tillerson, the new Secretary of State. We were at Foggy Bottom at the State Department. We're talking about China at one point, and he said he had just had a meeting with his counterpart, the foreign minister of China. He said the foreign minister came out and said the Chinese Communist government has 3 top priorities in foreign policy. And Rex kind of shook his head. He said, Ted, it's the damnedest thing. one of their top 3 priorities is to prevent your bill to rename the street in front of their embassy from passing. I'll tell you what I told Rex that morning. At the time, Liu Xiaobo had passed away. He had never collected the over $1 million that he was entitled to for winning the Nobel Peace Prize. But his widow, Liu Xia, was still in China. China would not let her go. And I told Rex, you go back to China and you tell them the following. If they release Liu Xia, if they let her go, I will stop pressing to pass this bill. But if they don't, I will continue pressing to pass it, and we will succeed. I've already passed it 100-0 in the United States Senate, and the next time we're going to get it passed in the House as well and get it passed into law. Madam President, just a few weeks later, Communist China released Liu Xia. She was able to receive the prize money for the Nobel Peace Prize and escape the oppression of Communist China. Madam President, this story speaks volumes about the weakness of a tyrannical regime, just how vulnerable they are to sunshine, to truth, to transparency, to being called out. Renaming the street in front of the Cuban embassy after Oswaldo Payá would shine a light and would highlight the truth about the communist regime in Cuba. It would be a powerful tool in bringing down the machinery of oppression there. We saw not long ago thousands of Cubans taking to the street, fighting for liberty. The Cuban people should know the American people stand with them against tyranny, against the communist oppression, the poverty, the misery, the death under which they live every day. And it would be a powerful tool to bringing down the machinery of oppression in Cuba in the nonviolent way that Oswaldo Payá so powerfully championed. This Congress, I'm very hopeful that my bill to rename the street in front of the Cuban embassy, Oswaldo Payá Way, will be passed by both chambers. Oswaldo Payá fought for a free Cuba, Cuba Libre, a Cuba built on human decency, on human rights, where citizens are heard, not murdered by their government. Let's come together, Democrats and Republicans, to honor Oswaldo Payá. Let's come together and force the communist regime to say his name. I yield the floor. And I quorum.
Will the senator withhold your request?
I will withhold my request. Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, crime is surging across this nation. Murder rates have risen over the last 3 years. Carjackings are rising. Robberies are rising. Today, I want to discuss the resolution disapproving of the D.C. City Council's decision to eliminate mandatory minimums and to reduce maximum sentences for violent crimes, including robbery, carjacking, and burglary. The D.C. City Council made this decision to lower penalties late last year, despite the fact that crime has been skyrocketing in this city. In the past 12 months, overall crime is up 25% in D.C. Car theft has increased 110% in D.C., and homicides have increased 30%. Who in their right mind looks to those rising crime rates and says the answer is to lower the penalties for violent crime? And D.C.'s spike in crime is hardly confined to the last 12 months. In 2021, the number of murders in D.C. was the highest it's been since 2003. The mayor of D.C., a Democrat, vetoed the City Council's decision to rewrite the criminal code, saying, quote, "Anytime there's a policy that reduces penalties, I think it sends the wrong message." Unfortunately, the Democrats on the City Council in D.C. overrode her veto. Time and time again, we've seen Democrats in major cities reducing penalties for crime, and we've seen, as a result, crime spiking. We've seen this in San Francisco. We've seen this in Los Angeles. We've seen this in Portland. We've seen this in Boston. We've seen this in Philadelphia. We've seen this in New York. We've seen this in St. Louis. We've seen this in Chicago. Crime is spiking in D.C., and it is incredibly harmful to the men and women and children who live in D.C. to be lowering the penalties for violent crime. That's why I'm proud to support the resolution to disapprove of the D.C. City Council's decision, and I thank my friend from Tennessee for his leadership in bringing this resolution. This has already passed the House, and I believe it will pass the Senate as well. And despite being soft on crime his entire presidency, President Biden has said he will sign it if it passes the Senate. Now, that's remarkable, given Biden's record on crime. That's remarkable, given that Biden has nominated not one, not two, but three of the leading advocates of abolishing the police to senior positions at the Department of Justice. And I'm sorry to say, every Democrat in this chamber voted to confirm not one, not two, but all three of those advocates of abolishing the police to senior positions in the Department of Justice. One of those was a George Soros-backed prosecutor in Massachusetts who, like the D.C. City Council, put out a list of crimes that she would not allow her prosecutors to prosecute, endangering the citizens she was charged to protect. What was her reward for refusing to prosecute violent criminals? President Biden nominated her to be the U.S. Attorney for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and every Senate Democrat voted to confirm her as the U.S. Attorney, the chief federal prosecutor in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now, once President Biden said he would sign this bill, the political pressure it has put on the D.C. City Council has had enormous impact. This week, the council tried to withdraw the legislation. Never mind, was their response. But simply withdrawing a bill doesn't permanently get rid of it under the Home Rule Act, which allows Congress to review legislation that comes out of the D.C. City Council. To permanently stop the D.C. Council's harmful bill, Congress should proceed and pass the resolution of disapproval, and President Biden should follow through on his commitment to sign it. A recent poll found that 77% of Americans believe that violent crime is a major problem. Democrats, tragically, have been soft on crime for years, and crime has surged as a result. At the end of the day, it's not complicated. If you let violent criminals go, they commit more and more violent crimes. We have seen patterns all over the country of mass murders carried out by violent criminals who Democrat DAs have let out of jail only to see them turn around and commit more violent crimes. Congress right now has an opportunity to come together and to speak in a bipartisan way and to say enough is enough is enough. Stop letting violent criminals out of jail. Let's protect our citizens. Let's do our job. I urge every senator, Republican and Democrat, to support this resolution. And I yield the floor.
Proposes an amendment number 9.
Mr. President, there's no responsibility we have as members of Congress more serious than protecting the men and women who defend this nation. We're facing a national security crisis due to Joe Biden and his administration, who have repeatedly been unwilling to act against repeated hostilities from the nation of Iran. They have looked repeatedly for excuses to justify that inaction. Now, I want to be clear. I am not where some members of this body are who want to maintain this authorization for use of military force. I want to vote to repeal this authorization of use of military force. The Iraq War was a long time ago. I believe the Iraq War was a mistake at the time it was fought. And I would be enthusiastic about Congress reasserting its war-making and war-declaring power by repealing the AUMF. But at the same time, I don't want the repeal of the AUMF to be used as an excuse by the Biden administration to roll over and do nothing if and when Iran attacks and murders American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in the Middle East. And, Mr. President, this is not hypothetical. Just last week, General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, testified before the House that from January 2021 until last week, there were 78 attacks against American forces in the Middle East by Iranian-linked fighters. 78. The Biden administration responded 3 times. 75 of them went unresponded. Tragically, but predictably, appeasement doesn't work. On Thursday morning, the CENTCOM commander was testifying in front of the House. Here on the floor of the Senate, we were debating this very issue, the AUMF and Iranian aggression. We now know that at 6:30 in the morning Eastern Time on Thursday, Iran attacked U.S. forces, murdered a United States citizen, a U.S. contractor, and wounded 6 other Americans. That happened at 6:30 in the morning Eastern Time on Thursday. Mr. President, you didn't know that on Thursday. Mr. President, I didn't know that on Thursday. None of us knew that on Thursday. Why? Because the Biden administration kept it a secret for 12 hours. Because they didn't want to tell the Senate while we were debating this issue that an American had just been murdered by Iran. That's disgraceful. You should be angry about it. I should be angry about it. My amendment is very simple. My amendment restates that under Article 2 of the Constitution, the President has the authority to defend U.S. troops and to respond to Iranian aggression. The opponents of this bill, my friend Senator Kaine will speak shortly. What he said in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he said the amendment's unnecessary. Article 2 already does that. Well, good. If it is unnecessary, then the Democrats ought to support my amendment and add it. Because I'll tell you what it will get. If we add this amendment, I will vote yes on the AUMF repeal. If we don't add this amendment, I'm a no. And here's why. I don't want to give an excuse for the Biden administration the next time Iran attacks to do nothing. And if it's unnecessary legally, it ought to be an easy give to say, let's add it to be clear. If you attack U.S. forces, the President has the authority to respond. Because I don't want the Biden administration using the repeal of the AUMF as an excuse for their weakness, as an excuse for their appeasement. There are some in the political world that are in favor of unending wars. I am not one of them. But I am in favor of the United States defending our soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines. And let me say this. I don't know if the amendment's going to get the votes or not to pass. I think we will get most of the Republicans. I don't know if any Democrats will vote for it or not. But if this amendment is defeated and the Congress goes on to repeal the AUMF, and Iran takes that as encouragement that the Biden administration will not retaliate, I believe the consequences will be lives lost. I believe we'll be back on this floor with American soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines who have lost their lives due to Iranian aggression because the Ayatollah believed the Biden administration would not respond. You don't want to see that, Mr. President. I don't want to see that. I believe no member of this body wants to see that. And if it's legally redundant all the better to say, let's send the message of the Ayatollah: if you attack American forces, the President, the Commander-in-Chief, has the authority to respond and defend American forces. That is the number one responsibility of every member of this. A few months ago, I spoke from this floor about Mark Swidan, who has been unjustly imprisoned by the Chinese Communist Party for over a decade. Mark is from Luling, a small city in my home state of Texas. His mother, Ms. Catherine Swidan, still lives in Luling. And for the last 11 years, Mark has endured a living hell trapped in a Chinese prison. He's exposed to extreme heat and extreme cold. He's deprived of sleep. He's subjected to physical abuse. Mark has also been denied access to his family and to American diplomats. And in 2019, a Chinese court sentenced Mark to death. Mark is being unjustly held by the Chinese Communist Party as a hostage. The CCP tells us that China is a great power, but this is how third world thugs and dictators act. I called for Mark's immediate release and called on the Biden administration to use any and every available means to secure Mark's freedom. Madam President, I'm deeply distressed that since my speech on the floor a few months ago, Mark's plight has deepened. Recently, a Chinese court reaffirmed the death sentence imposed on him with a suspension for 2 years. That is wrong, and it's outrageous. We need Mark to come home. It's worth reviewing how breathtakingly, infuriatingly unjust all of this is. How did it happen? On November 13th, 2012, Mark was abducted by China's Public Security Bureau while he was in China on a business trip. A witness to the abduction has said Mark was detained because Chinese officials wanted to view the contents of his cell phone. The Chinese officials accused Mark of being part of a criminal conspiracy to manufacture and traffic drugs with 11 other individuals, charges that Mark has denied and which have been debunked over and over again. Chinese officials tried to coerce Mark into confessing. Mark refused, and he pleaded not guilty in a trial in November of 2013. During the trial, the prosecution didn't produce any forensic evidence to back up their allegations, and no drugs, zero, were ever found on Mark or in his hotel room. Mark's passport and other records show that he wasn't even in China at the time of the alleged offenses. And the 11 other individuals indicted in relation to this alleged drug conspiracy, none of them could identify Mark. The charges against Mark were completely bogus and false. Meanwhile, mom's Mark, Catherine, is aching to see her son again. Her heart is breaking. This is a mom who wants to hold and hug and care for the son she loves. I've been working with the Biden administration, and I've been pushing Chinese officials at a senior level to release Mark. But more needs to be done, and it needs to be done much more quickly. Now, Secretary of State Blinken was planning to travel to China in February, and we had been pressing the State Department to make Mark's case a major priority for the Biden administration on the trip. Then what happened? A Chinese spy balloon came over the United States, and Secretary Blinken canceled his trip. It's time to apply more pressure on the Chinese Communist Party to let Mark go and let him come home to Texas. Madam President, the Chinese Communist government is a tyrannical government, but they don't like it when you turn up the heat. They don't like it when you shine a light on their atrocities. There is power in shining a light, and there is power in unity. We need to bring Mark home. In a moment, I'm going to propound a live UC request on a resolution I've introduced with my colleague from Texas, Senator John Cornyn. When it passes, the Senate will, with one unanimous bipartisan voice, reiterate these declarations. The resolution calls on the CCP to immediately release Mark. It condemns China for withholding from Mark access to his family, to diplomats, and to proper and independent medical care. And it calls on the Biden administration to prioritize efforts to secure Mark's release, both in their conversations with Chinese diplomats and in international forums. No opportunity should be lost in urging Chinese officials at every level of engagement to release Mark. The Biden administration must use the voice and the vote of American diplomats to highlight his case. This resolution has already passed the House. It will now pass the Senate. The United States Congress is, with a united and unanimous voice, condemning and calling to end the unjust imprisonment of Mark Swidan by the Chinese Communist Party. Enough is enough. Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of calendar number 53, S-Res 23.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 53, Senate Resolution 23, demanding that the government of the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party of China immediately release Mark Swidan.
Is there an objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection, so ordered.
Madam President, I yield the floor. Mr. President, this week, the Senate unanimously passed my bipartisan legislation to rename the street in front of the Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C., Oswaldo Payá Way. Oswaldo Payá was a dissident and a fighter for freedom in Cuba of unrelenting passion and dedication. He was someone who stood up against the Castro regime. He had incredible courage. He spoke up for human rights. He spoke up for free speech. He spoke up for democracy. And 11 years ago, Oswaldo Payá was murdered by the Cuban Communist government. On July 22nd, 2012, Payá left his house with 3 other people, including Harold Cepero, to go visit friends. From the start of the journey, their car was followed. On the way, the Cuban security services drove Payá's car off the road, killing both him and Cepero. There has never been any doubt about who was responsible for these murders. And indeed, just this week, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights released its long-awaited report on the case. The determination was clear and conclusive in confirming what we have known all along. Payá had long been a thorn in the side of the Castros and the regime, even from a young age. He was the only person at school who refused to join the communist youth. As a teenager, he publicly opposed the communist crackdown on protesters in Czechoslovakia who were fighting for freedom, and he was punished with 3 years in prison. Payá went on to found the Valero Project, which sought a referendum on Cuba's communist system. Their demands were simple: democratic government, religious liberty, freedom of expression, and the economic freedom to start businesses. Payá managed to get 11,000 signatures to support the Valero Project, to petition the regime to hold a referendum, and eventually, over 20,000 people supported the call. But the Cuban regime refused to hold one. Payá's fight for freedom made him a target of the Communist Party in Cuba. They harassed him, They tried to intimidate him. They arrested him numerous times. And ultimately, they murdered him. Paya's friend and the driver of the car said that when he awoke after the crash, he was confronted at the hospital by a regime operative, and the hospital was flooded with uniformed military personnel. Under extreme duress, drugged, and threatened with death by regime officials, he signed a document falsely exonerating the regime. That is how important it was to the communists to immediately try to hide their crimes and avoid accountability. It is imperative that they fail in those tasks. I'm heartened that yesterday the Senate unanimously passed this bipartisan legislation that I led to rename the street in front of the Cuban embassy here in Washington, D.C., after Paya. I want to thank Senator Durbin, who led this effort with me, along with Senator Rubio, Senator Menendez, Senator Rick Scott, and Senator Cardin, all who joined with me in this bipartisan effort. This week, the Senate spoke in one unanimous voice, and it was a voice speaking out for freedom. I also want to acknowledge the tireless work of Paya's daughter, Rosa Maria, who has fought tenaciously and never wavered in pursuing and advocating her father's legacy. She is an incredible, courageous, powerful leader in her own right. And together we have sat down and discussed ways of advancing the cause of justice in Cuba. We will continue doing so. This is the second time that the Senate has passed this bipartisan legislation. In the previous Congress, the House of Representatives declined to take it up. But I urge our colleagues in the House to take it up and pass it this year. And I have a high level of confidence that the House will do that. We need to make this a law, to put it on Joe Biden's desk, and to rename the street outside of the Cuban embassy. Now, when we change this street name, we're not merely changing signs. It can be a reminder, indeed a forceful one, that shines a light of truth on the regime. Changing the name of the street means that anyone who wants to write to the Cuban embassy will have to write Oswaldo Paya's name. Or if you need to go there, you'll have to look up the address and see his name. Members of the Cuban regime who deal with the embassy will have to acknowledge that Paya existed. Their efforts to erase his existence and his legacy failed. Mr. President, I've told this story before, but it's worth retelling because it illustrates just how much of an impact renaming a street in front of an embassy can be. A few years ago, I introduced legislation to rename the street in front of the Chinese embassy Liu Xiaobo Plaza, after the famed Nobel Peace Laureate and democracy activist in China who was wrongfully imprisoned in China. After multiple iterations on the Senate floor, my bill ended up passing the Senate, a Democrat Senate with a Democrat majority. My bill passed the Senate unanimously. Unfortunately, the House of Representatives failed to take that bill up as well. It was infuriating. However, at the beginning of the Trump administration in 2017, I was having breakfast with Rex Tillerson, then the new Secretary of State, at his office at Foggy Bottom. We were talking about the challenges facing America, and he had recently just met with his counterpart, the Chinese foreign minister. And Secretary Tillerson said the foreign minister from China told him that China had 3 critical foreign policies, at which point Rex shook his head and said, Ted, it was the damnedest thing. One of their top 3 priorities was stopping you from renaming the street in front of their embassy in D.C. That's how concerned, that's how terrified she and his communist cronies were of the world being reminded on a daily basis about Liu Xiaobo. Ultimately, I told Secretary Tillerson the following, which is Liu Xiaobo had passed away at that point, but his widow, Liu Xia, was still in China. China would not let her leave. She had never gone to collect the over $1 million that she was due for her husband winning the Nobel Peace Prize. So I told Secretary Tillerson, you tell the Chinese government, if they release Liu Xia, if they allow her to leave and escape to freedom, I'll stop pushing this particular bill. But if they don't, I will keep pushing it, and we will pass it into law. And you can let them know it's not a bluff because I've already passed it unanimously through the Senate once, and we'll do it again, and this time the House will pass it as well. Within a matter of weeks, Mr. President, the communist government in China released Liu Xia and let her escape. That's how powerful shining a light of truth on a despotic regime can be. Mr. President, renaming the street outside of the Cuban embassy sends a powerful message to the Cuban people that their struggle for freedom will not go unnoticed or be forgotten, that the world is watching and their heroic efforts are not in vain. Their fight for freedom resonates deeply with people across the globe. By passing this legislation, the United States Senate has made a powerful statement of solidarity with the people of Cuba and a resolute condemnation of the oppressive regime that silenced a brave voice for freedom. The Senate has spoken with one voice, and that voice has demanded Cuba Libre, a free Cuba, an end to the totalitarian and despotic state. I urge our colleagues in the House to take up this bill, to pass this bipartisan legislation swiftly. Let us come together as one, as the United States Congress, and force the communist regime to do what utterly terrifies them, to say Oswaldo Payá's name, to say his name. I yield the floor. Mr. President, I rise today to honor an extraordinary Texan and an incredibly dear friend. Karen K. Tinsley Goolsby passed away on Monday, June 19th, 2023. Kay is someone who's been an incredible friend to me for 2 decades now. She lived in Katy, Texas, married to the love of her life, Gary. Their son, Greg, born in 1981. She loved her family. She loved her grandkids. Kay was a grassroots organizer unlike any other. Kay was incredibly active in the Texas Federation of Republican Women and the National Federation of Republican Women. I still remember when I first met Kay. It was 2004. It was at the Republican National Convention. And I was a 33-year-old young lawyer. I was serving as the Solicitor General of Texas. I had hopes to run for office. But I didn't know a whole lot of people in politics. And at that convention, I met Kay Goolsby. She lit up any room she was in. She had a personality that was incandescent. And as Kay would later observe, for some reason, this kid, that'd be me, just followed her everywhere she went. And at the end of the day, it wasn't complicated. Kay knew everybody. And when I followed Kay from one grassroots activist to another, Kay would turn around and introduce me one after the other, say, have you met Ted? Have you met Ted? Have you met Ted? She had the energy of an atom bomb. It was unstoppable. Kay became one of my very closest friends and most trusted advisors when I first launched a campaign for Attorney General of Texas. I remember sitting in Kay's car for about 3 hours trying to convince her to come support our campaign, that I needed her. And she quite rightly said, are you out of your mind? You don't have the support, you don't have the money, you don't have the name ID. How on earth can you possibly win? My answer was, Kay, with your support, we can do anything. After about 3 hours, her husband, Gary, who's also a dear friend, he told her, he said, Kay, just say yes. He's going to keep asking you until you do. And she finally laughed and said yes. That race for Attorney General never ended up materializing. The vacancy we thought existed ended up not happening. But 2 years later, I launched a campaign for United States Senate, and Kay was my grassroots chairman. I'll tell you, in that race, I was supposed to have no prayer. My opponent in that race was the incumbent lieutenant governor, who was personally worth $200 million, who had put $35 million of his own money in the race, and I'd never been elected to anything. Last thing I was elected to was the student council. But we had a weapon unlike anything else. We had Kay Goolsbee. You have to understand, Kay would be on 3 cell phones at once, calling people relentlessly, and she'd greet them all the same way. She'd go, hey, sugar. And sugar, she could drag that second syllable out 3 sentences. And she'd be talking to people all over the state. Early on in the Senate campaign, we rolled out a list of Republican women leaders in TFRW across the state who'd endorsed my campaign. We rolled out a list, and it was like a cannon shot. It shocked everyone. That was 100% Kay. That was Kay on the phone with one after the other saying, trust me, this kid, he's going to do what he said. After that, a few weeks later, we rolled out a second endorsement list with over 80 leaders of the Republican Women's Club all over the state. In response to that release, my opponent in that race fired his campaign manager. That's how big a deal it was. He had assumed that all the Republican women's clubs across the state would be with him, but he did not understand that when you had Kay working the phones and working the phones and working the phones, and I would travel around with Kay from event to event to event, and she couldn't be stopped. She'd take me to this person, to that person, to the next person. It was relentless. In 2016, when I ran for president, Kay was my national grassroots chairman. Kay and I spent hundreds of hours on the bus together in Iowa, out on the ground in New Hampshire and South Carolina, all over the country. And I'll tell you, Kay would talk to Republican women in every state. Mr. President, you're from the great state of Hawaii. I guarantee you, Kay was on the phone with Republican women in the state of Hawaii. She had an energy that was fiery. And boy, she could get mad. Kay's chewed me out probably more than my wife Heidi has. She would get mad at this or that or whatever you did, and she'd tell you exactly what she thought. I remember once Kay was really mad at me. I don't even remember for what. But I had to drive all the way out to her house in Katy, Texas, sit in her living room while she spent about an hour and a half explaining to me how I'd screwed something up she was mad at me for. She also made me eat some of her homemade brownies, which Kay had a lot of wonderful gifts, but cooking was not one of them. And the brownies were pretty terrible, but I told Kay they were delicious, and I appreciated it. And I took my medicine. Kay and I, as we were talking to Republican women's groups, I used to say all the time that Republican women are the heart and soul. And when I say that, Kay from the back of the room would call out, "And the brains!" And everyone would laugh, and I'd say, "And the brains of the Republican Party." It started off as an ad-lib joke, but it became something we said all over the state and eventually all over the country. Kay had kidney disease and liver disease. She spent the last several months waiting on the list for a transplant. Kay was a tiny lady. She needed a small liver. Several times, it looked like they were going to find a liver, a kidney. Just a few weeks ago, I got a text from Gary. It looks like we've got one. The surgery is tomorrow. That next morning, I woke up praying for Kay until I got a text a couple hours later. Said the surgery fell through. The transplant wasn't a match. I've never known someone like Kay Goolsby. Kay loved this country. Loved it. She loved Texas. And she was so fierce and so full of love. When Kay passed, I texted her husband, and I later put out on Twitter. I said, "The angels are weeping, and so am I. But I'll tell you this, I have no doubt that right now up in heaven, Kay Goolsby is organizing and reorganizing everything. She's going to the angels saying, this isn't right, you need to change this, you need to move this over here, we can do better." After a long struggle with liver and kidney disease, Kay's gone to be with the Lord. Those of us she left behind were hurting. We'll miss her. I'll still wonder when my phone rings if on the other end is going to be that lilting Southern accent saying, "Hey, sugar." But we're going to have to wait a little while to hear it again. It's one of my favorite pictures. You can see the joy. She could laugh, and she brought that joy to everyone else. Her grandkids called her KK. My daughters called her KK too. To Kay Goolsby, my dear, dear friend, the heart and soul, and the brains. We love you, Kay. I yield the floor. President, many Americans remember waking up on Saturday morning to watch their favorite cartoons, including shows like The Jetsons. As I look at the Senate pages who are here, I suspect none of you have any memory of The Jetsons. For those who are under 40 in the chamber or watching at home, The Jetsons was a futuristic cartoon set in the year 2062. And it depicted a family from the future who had fun, imaginative technologies like jetpacks and holograms and video calls and robot vacuums and smart watches and flying cars. While we're still waiting to see those flying cars in the air, we already have a lot of the Jetsons' technology available to us now. In many cases, even better than what was depicted in cartoon on the show. Today, internet-connected smart devices are commonly used in American households. Light bulbs, mirrors, air fryers, coffee makers, trash cans, kitchen faucets, refrigerators, and more are all becoming, quote-unquote, smart. And we're able to control them with our phones or voice commands. A lot of that is really cool. It's expected that in a few years, nearly 70% of American households, more than 80 million households, will own at least one smart home product. And this is by and large a good thing. Smart devices can help us improve our quality of life and complete daily tasks more easily. But with any technological advancement, there can be trade-offs. And for smart devices, one of the potential trade-offs is our privacy. In Texas, we've become very aware of that cost. The past few years, smart thermostats have allowed electric companies to control the temperature in your own home from afar in the name of conserving energy. Furthermore, a lot of Americans don't realize or expect that the growing number of smart household devices and appliances have cameras on them and microphones that can surreptitiously record families and transmit data. In other words, when you're buying a new refrigerator, you don't expect your fridge to record you or listen to you or spy on you without your knowledge. And while some manufacturers have responsibly taken steps to more clearly label their products and to let consumers know they contain listening devices or cameras, others have not. And so, I've introduced bipartisan legislation, which I authored alongside Senator Cantwell of Washington, a Democrat and the chairman of the Commerce Committee. I'm the ranking member of the Commerce Committee. Our bipartisan legislation would simply ensure that this information is clearly communicated to consumers so that you're informed before you buy a product that's going to photograph you or film you or record you, so that doesn't happen against your wishes and without your knowledge. Now, I expect in a minute we're going to hear opposition to my bill. Opposition focused on the proposition that any mandate put on a private company is somehow a burden. And it's a mandate to require your refrigerator manufacturer to tell you if your fridge is spying on you. Now, I'm sympathetic to the argument that there are too many mandates from government, and that many of the mandates are unnecessary and burdensome and costly. But requiring a manufacturer to tell you if they're spying on you does not fall into that category. And I have to say, in assessing the minimal burden, the disclosure burden, against the harm, I fall down on the side of individual liberty. I fall down on the side of privacy. I don't think the American people want their air fryer spying on them, and at a minimum, they have a right to know if their air fryer is spying on them. Now, I would note, my colleagues on both sides of the aisle agree. The presiding officer today serves on the Commerce Committee. This legislation passed the Commerce Committee by voice vote, with bipartisan support from both sides of the aisle. This should be a simple, easy, pro-privacy step to protect consumers. For that reason, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 538, and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the Cruz Cantwell substitute amendment at the desk be considered and agreed to. The bill as amended be considered read a third time and passed, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Kentucky.
reserving the right to object, far too often Congress operates under the delusion that we know what is best for the American consumer. Instead of allowing market participants to determine the information they want, we seek to manipulate the free market to impose our preferences on private actors. As I'm sure my colleague will readily agree, the federal government is far too large in size and scope. In this case, additional federal regulation and the associated potential penalties and costs is not appropriate. This is not a case of industry committing fraud or making willful misrepresentations about their products. This bill simply mandates what manufacturers must tell consumers because it assumes that consumers are not sophisticated enough to make the judgment themselves. If American consumers want more information about a product, they can be sure they will make it known. If a manufacturer wants to sell more of their products, you can be sure they will listen to the consumers. Congress doesn't need to insert itself into every equation. I object.
Objection is noted.
Mr. President,
Senator from Texas.
so I've listened to the objections of my friend from Kentucky, and I use that word as many do on this floor, although he's not listening to my response, but that's his choice. The first time I ever spoke on the floor was in support of Senator Paul's filibuster in 2013. Senator Paul is fond of telling his constituents that he's a libertarian, that he defends privacy. I'm not quite a libertarian, I'm a conservative, but I have strong libertarian leanings. And I want to note the irony that Senator Paul, who's devoted his entire public career to defending liberty and defending privacy, just objected to protecting the privacy of over 300 million Americans. Just objected to Americans knowing whether they're being spied on at home. I have to admit, it's truly flabbergasting. I'd like to invite my colleague, Senator Paul, to join me in front of a gathering of libertarians. And let's discuss with libertarians which side of the aisle you want to be on. Do you want to be on the side of big business, surreptitiously tape recording, photographing, and videoing you in your home, in your bedroom, without you knowing about it? Or is a mild and nominal disclosure requirement simply saying if you're going to tape record someone or videotape them in their house, you got to tell them? Is that a justifiable burden? I hope that in time reason will prevail, because we ought to be protecting privacy. This is a bill, if we vote on the Senate floor, I'm confident the vote would be 99-1. I am confident every senator, except the senator who just objected, would support this bill. Protecting people's privacy is a good idea, and I hope the Senate can get there as a body. I yield the floor. Mr. President, I want to say a few words in support of this bipartisan bill. This is a Cruz, Manchin, Ernst, Fetterman bill, which demonstrates the breadth of agreement we can have in this body. This amendment would prevent the sale of our nation's emergency crude oil stockpile, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, to 4 countries who are unequivocally U.S. adversaries. We know that China has been amassing the largest stockpile of crude in the world. At the same time, our own reserves have fallen to only 347 million barrels, the lowest since 1983. Last year, the United States sold off part of our reserves to China. One would think that existing law would prevent this, but that isn't yet the case. For some time now, Senator Manchin and I have been working together to try to fix this issue. Our amendment prevents the federal government from selling oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to China, to Russia, to Iran, or to North Korea and their related entities, while giving the Department of Energy flexibility to waive these restrictions in the event doing so serves our national security interests. I want to thank Senator Manchin for working closely with me on this amendment, and also Senators Ernst and Fetterman. And I also want to note briefly, I know there are some members of this body that believe we should ban all oil sales overseas. I would note doing so would be spectacularly harmful, not only to U.S. interests, but it would also hurt our friends and allies. It would hurt Ukraine, it would hurt Europe, and it would benefit our enemies, including Russia, to force our friends to have to purchase oil from Russia. I urge adoption of the amendment, and I yield the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise to oppose this amendment. I want to tell my colleagues why. This amendment creates the illusion of solving a problem while having very little political impact and likely doing more harm than good. It is a legitimate worry to consider the amount of U.S. oil under our lands that goes and is shipped to China. Because in 2022, the United States did export over 83 million barrels of oil to China. Now, that was a new record. It was a new record in part because 10 years ago, we didn't ship any oil overseas because we had a national security policy to keep U.S. oil here. But lobbying by the oil industry changed that policy, and so today we're sending 83 million barrels of oil a year to China. But this amendment doesn't really change that, because you want to know how much of that comes from the SPR? Less than 2 million barrels, 1 to 2%. And so you are still going to have 80 million plus barrels of oil from the private sector being sent to China every year. Now, ExxonMobil alone made $60 billion in profits last year, much of that off sales of oil to China. And this amendment allows for the oil industry to keep making those billions off of selling oil to China, only stripping out sales from the SPR. Now, that's a great deal for the oil industry, but it gets better. When President Biden sold oil from the SPR last year, it helped cut the cost of a gallon of gasoline by up to 30 cents. Now, that hurt oil industry profits. And so, of course, the oil industry wants policies that restrict the sale of oil from the SPR while letting them sell oil to whoever they want, including China. This amendment claims to solve a problem while mainly having the result of padding and protecting oil industry profits, and I'd urge opposition.
Mr. President, I rise in support of the bipartisan amendment sponsored by my friends and colleagues, Senator Cruz, Fetterman, Ernst, and myself. Let me just say about this. This is something that we own. The people of America own the SPR. It's ours. We don't own the oils from the private sector unless we want to nationalize everything. I don't think we do. But with that being said, I appreciate my good friend and colleague from Connecticut, and I'm happy to work on all of the things that we're talking about here. What we have in front of us right now is the ability to finally say that the strategic oil reserves that the people of the United States own will not be compromised, especially by people who don't have our same values and will use it against us. We've seen the horrible effects of the Ukraine war when Putin basically weaponized energy. He weaponized oil. We can't allow that to happen. Here's the other thing about it. Following Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. ramped up production and exports to help meet global demand. It would have been devastating to the world. China, on the other hand, stockpiled oil and held back refinery production. And while China was stockpiling, one of its state-owned companies purchased over 1.4 million barrels from United States of America, the people of our great countries, from our own stock reserves. That's what we're trying to stop. I'm happy to work on all the other things, Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We have something in front of us right now that can stop this outrageous, basically raiding of our own stock supplies. So I really, really urge the adoption of this amendment. And I will tell you this amendment has tremendous and bipartisan support in Congress. We have over 20 bipartisan senators that support us. In the House, it passed unanimously, Democrats and Republicans. So please don't mess up our bipartisan record right now. Please vote to support this amendment.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President,
Senator from Texas.
I call up my amendment number 421 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
Senator from Texas, Mr. Cruz, proposes amendment number 421 to amendment number 935.
Madam President, last December, Marine General David Berger stated the obvious, that the Department of Defense's COVID vaccine mandate hurt recruiting and hurt retention. For several weeks now, our Democrat colleagues have been saying that military readiness is suffering due to promotion delays. Well, I have good news for my colleagues. My amendment will help address these problems. While last year's NDAA quite rightly repealed the vaccine mandate prospectively, problems caused by the mandate persist, including concerning recruiting, retention, and readiness. According to reports, the Biden administration dismissed over 8,400 military service members who had vaccine concerns. DOT routinely denied religious accommodation requests, violating the rights of service members protected by the Constitution and RFRA. DOD gave over 80% of these service members a, quote, general discharge, causing them to lose GI benefits and in some cases VA benefits, even though those were benefits earned through honorable service. My amendment rights these wrongs. It will allow service members dismissed over the vaccine mandate to seek reinstatement or a change in their discharge status. It restores lost GI and VA benefits. According to media reports, the DOD is already contemplating all of these actions, but I believe the Senate should lead to address these issues. They've ended the vaccine mandate, and it's not fair to the over 8,000 servicemen and women dismissed for a policy DOD no longer believes is necessary. I urge members to support my amendment.
The senator from Rhode Island.
President, I oppose the amendment because one of the fundamental aspects of the military is the ability of a senior to issue an order and the willingness of a subordinate to accept that order. And what we're dealing with here are individuals without appropriate justification refusing to carry out a lawful order. Now, the vaccination policies of the military are rather robust. There's, I think, more than a dozen required vaccinations. And someone who just could cavalierly dismiss that requirement and then claim that they should not be and somehow held accountable, I think is wrong. But this goes to the fabric of the military. You must obey lawful orders, and all of these were lawful orders. Mandatory vaccination, again, is not a new, novel technique. And the other aspect of this is this went right to the heart of readiness. We can all recall when an aircraft carrier in the Pacific had to be evacuated because of COVID aboard the ship, and the ship was actually out of commission for several months. That is a readiness issue that's pretty obvious. There are procedures to be reinstated in the military, and they've been in effect for many, many years. There is a board procedure. You can bring forth evidence that your dismissal is not appropriate, and that's being pursued now, I assume, by many people, or at least some. So this would really, I think, basically signal that you don't have to obey legal orders from your commander if you're accepting popular notions about what's right and what's not right. And I think we should reject this amendment.
The question is on the amendment.
Ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr.
Mr. President,
Senator from Texas.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today as Israel is at war. They are at war in response to a genocidal assault by the Iran terrorist group Hamas, an assault against Israel and against America, and against the citizens of dozens of other countries. The numbers are staggering. Over 1,400 Israelis killed, thousands more wounded and tortured, over 199 kidnapped. Alongside them, 30 Americans killed and about a dozen kidnapped. By far, one of the deadliest attacks against Americans in history. And so our Israeli allies are rightly going to war to eradicate Hamas. Mr. President, we often hear that Israel and the United States share the same interests and the same enemies. That when Israel fights for its own security, they are also fighting for ours. Rarely in history has that been so explicitly, horribly true. And let's be clear about what they are fighting against. What we saw on October 7th, in the early hours of Saturday, October 7th, was pure evil unleashed. Genocidal, exterminationist violence. Nazi tactics in pursuit of Nazi aims. Entire Israeli families were murdered in door-to-door horrors. Israeli babies were brutally slaughtered, burned, and decapitated. Women and young girls were systematically raped. In some homes, children were shot right in front of their parents. In other homes, parents were shot right in front of their children. And then the children were kidnapped. Husbands and wives murdered in front of each other. Holocaust survivors massacred. In one home, Israelis found the burned remains of an adult and a child who died hugging each other in terror as they were murdered. They were burned to death, clutching each other in their home. And throughout these atrocities, Hamas terrorists gleefully filmed themselves in ecstatic joy. There are harrowing videos of Israeli babies and toddlers in the hands of Hamas terrorists after they were kidnapped. Why were these crimes committed? Because the victims were Jews in Israel. Because Hamas and the Iranian regime, which arms, funds, and controls Hamas, because both are committed to the eradication of Jews. It was the biggest mass murder of the Jewish people in a single day since the Holocaust. At the Supernova Music Festival, which was billed as a celebration of friends, love, and infinite freedom, young Israelis were dancing when Hamas assassins paraglided in, raining terror from the skies. They shot at defenseless Israelis, murdering 260 of them. They systematically raped survivors. They shot those who were too brutalized to be moved, and they kidnapped others. At Kibbutz Be'eri, 120 people were murdered. Hamas terrorists infiltrated the kibbutz from several directions, and they went home by home, murdering people. One of the victims was Tom Hand's 8-year-old daughter, Emily, who was at a sleepover with her friends. Tom is a single father. His wife, Emily's mom, had passed away earlier from cancer. On that Saturday morning when Hamas invaded the kibbutz, Tom thankfully was able to get out alive. Emily was murdered. In another kibbutz, 16-year-old Rotem Matthias was with his parents, Deborah and Shlomi, when Hamas terrorists came into their home. The terrorists shot Shlomi in the arm, blowing his arm off. Deborah, heroically, shielded Rotem with her body to save him. Both of Rotem's parents were murdered. At kibbutz Nir Oz, Yarden and Shiri Bibas, along with their 3-year-old son and their 9-month-old son, they were all hiding in their home when Hamas terrorists entered. They took Shiri and her sons and they kidnapped them. No one has heard from Yarden. Shiri and her sons are now hostages in Gaza, as well as Shiri's parents. These were all by design. We know from documents discovered on terrorist bodies that their goals were to, quote, kill as many as possible and, quote, capture hostages. We know they sought out specifically children, and they went specifically to children's rooms. In the face of this evil, Israel must and Israel will defend herself. America's policy should be absolutely unequivocal to ensure that Israel has the military and the diplomatic support to utterly eradicate Hamas for as long as it takes. I want to repeat that last part. For as long as it takes. I give you my word that I will do everything in my power and ability and use every resource at my disposal to ensure that that is indeed America's policy. So what do we do immediately? We know what Israel needs in the short term. Our Israeli allies need air defenses and they need weapons. We must make sure together that they get them. If we can get those things from pre-positioned weapons we keep on their soil, the war reserve stock, that's where we'll get them from. If it needs to be shipped to them, we'll ship them to them. And if the president needs more authorization or more money, Congress must find a way to give it to him. Over the last week, we've heard objections from various parts of Capitol Hill about arming Israel. There have instead been calls for withholding support and pressuring Israel into an immediate ceasefire. These people draw a moral equivalency between our Israeli allies and these Hamas terrorists. Mr. President, this is a battle between good and evil. And anyone who draws a moral equivalency between Hamas and Israel is shamefully lying. This is an existential fight for Israel. As Golda Meir once said, quote, "If the Arabs put down their weapons today, there would be no more violence. If the Jews put down their weapons, there would be no more Israel." That is as true today as it was when she said that. Hamas uses human shields as standard practice. Israel does everything it can to minimize civilian casualties. They are polar opposites. The Israeli government asks innocent civilians to get out of harm's way. They go so far as to send texts to Palestinians warning them to evacuate. They do things like if they're going to bomb a building where they know Hamas rockets are stored, or they have terrorists hiding, they will send a text to every person in that building and even drop a dud bomb on top of the building that lands with a thud but doesn't explode, designed to warn the civilians, evacuate the building, because the next bomb to take out the weapons or take out the terrorist is going to explode. And then, no doubt, they will level the building because they're trying to get rid of murderers. No other military on earth goes to such extraordinary lengths to avoid civilian casualties. And there is no moral equivalency here, zero, between Israeli soldiers protecting civilians and Hamas monsters targeting babies. Much more needs to be done and can be done to counter the use of human shields by Hamas and other Iran-controlled terrorist organizations. In 2014, I was proud to author a resolution in the Senate co-sponsored by Democrat Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from New York, condemning the use of human shields by Hamas as a war crime. That bipartisan resolution passed the Senate 100 to nothing. And later, in 2019, I wrote and passed language that imposes sanctions on Hamas on Hezbollah, on any other terrorist group that uses human shields. Now, that was a much tougher fight, because sanctions always are. But by working in a bipartisan and bicameral fashion, we passed that law as well. Since 2019, there are new groups that are using human shields that need to be added, especially the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the law itself needs to be extended and strengthened. I intend to work in a bipartisan way to do exactly that in this Congress. Unequivocal support from the United States is critical. We are already seeing pressure from across the world and from far too many places here in Washington for our Israeli allies to stand down. It is unfortunately well known, predictable, that as soon as Israel begins to defend itself from terrorists, from the very beginning, a clock starts ticking until pressure on them to stand down becomes immense. It's a surreal, disquieting, and shameful spectacle. This time, the calls for Israel to stand down began while Hamas terrorists were still on Israeli territory, as the attack was ongoing. And I'm saddened to say they came, among other places, from within the Biden administration itself. As the Hamas invasion was becoming horrifically public, as the first reports of atrocities were being published, here's what the Biden State Department tweeted out, quote, "We unequivocally condemn the attack of Hamas terrorists and the loss of life that has incurred. We urge all sides to refrain from violence and retaliatory attacks. Terror and violence solve nothing." Now, to be clear, that was a message to the Israelis from the U.S. Department of State. Refrain from violence and retaliatory attacks. Terror and violence solves nothing, so do nothing against the terrorists who were then murdering over 1,000 Israelis. That was from the U.S. Office of Palestinian Affairs in the State Department. They sent this tweet out at 3 in the morning, D.C. time. Literally as these murders, as these rapes, as these brutal assaults were happening. I caught it within about an hour. And it was obvious what they were trying to do. So I made it clear what I intended to do, and I publicly responded to that tweet by saying, quote, "This is disgraceful, and every person involved in drafting and approving this tweet should be immediately expelled from the U.S. government." So their first instinct was to tell Israel, your country's being invaded, terrorists are murdering your civilians, your citizens are being kidnapped, infants and children are being murdered, and the position of the United States State Department is, Israel, please do nothing. Do not engage in retaliatory strikes, just sit there and allow the terrorists to murder your citizens. Within the hour, the State Department deleted their tweet. Later that day, they apologized. They said the tweet was unauthorized and it didn't reflect their policy. Except they weren't done. A few hours later, the Twitter account of the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, posted a note saying the Secretary of State was encouraging an immediate ceasefire. Understand, the words ceasefire are not directed at the terrorists. They're directed at Israel. They're saying, Israel, do not defend yourself. Do not kill the Hamas terrorists. I likewise denounced that tweet. And for the second time in 24 hours, the Department of State had to delete yet another tweet. That's in the first day that this attack proceeded. Mr. President, this is not a time for partisan disagreements. We should be standing together and with Israel. And I'll be the first to admit that much of what President Biden has said himself since then has been welcome. His first major speech on this crisis was very strong in parts. The problem is that this administration, this White House, this Department of State is filled with passionate opponents of Israel. And every time President Biden has spoken in support of Israel, he has been undercut by staffers before and after. The president just traveled to Israel yesterday in what was an unprecedented trip. I am glad the president went to Israel. That was a strong statement for him to be physically there on the ground during this war. But on the way there, literally on the plane, a White House spokesperson said the purpose of the trip was to have the president ask the Israelis, quote, tough questions. Even on the night before his speech last week, Biden's deputy national security advisor had gone on MSNBC and warned the Israelis, and I'll quote, "It is our advice that this war be conducted based on the principles of international law." Madam President, what does that mean? Has Israel ever not fought its wars based on the principles of international law? Why is that something they're publicly lecturing Israel on? And even if it did come up in discussions with Israel, why lecture them publicly? Madam President, I remember well September 11th, the horror of the greatest attack on the United States in American history. And I don't recall any American allies publicly lecturing America, follow international law. I don't recall any foreign heads of state traveling here to ask us the tough questions. Are you going to dare retaliate against the terrorists? Instead, our friends said, we stand with you, period. After President Biden's speech at the White House officials stated, quote, "We support Israel taking necessary and proportionate action." Understand that word proportionate. You're going to hear again. You're going to hear again from the enemies of Israel who are already preparing to attack and undermine each and every step Israel takes to eradicate the Hamas terrorists. They are going to say it's not proportionate. What is a proportionate response to the beheading of babies? What is a proportionate response to the systematic murder of entire families? For that matter, what is a proportionate response to a genocidal campaign? The Biden administration's ideological, partisan reaction day after day to all of this is tragic. They see these terrorist attacks, and their immediate reaction is, I hope Israel doesn't respond by killing the terrorists too much. Why? Well, because I think at least some in the Biden administration feel a need to appeal to the radical left-wing base, which includes BLM, which includes the Democratic Socialists of America, which includes the anti-Semitic squad in the House, as well as the woke university students at Harvard and other so-called elite universities. At Harvard, 35 student groups in the aftermath of Hamas's attack blamed Israel. These organizations, these elite universities, sadly have become venomous pits of anti-Semitism and hatred for Israel. The 35 student groups at Harvard put out a joint statement by the Harvard Palestine Solidarity Group. And I want the American people to know what they said. They said, quote, "We, the undersigned students' organizations, hold the Israeli regime entirely responsible for all the unfolding violence. That's the opening sentence of their statement. They believe it's Israel's fault that Hamas terrorists are raping women and young girls in the street. They believe it is Israel's fault that Hamas is mutilating babies and kidnapping them and holding them hostage. They believe it is Israel's fault that Hamas is using toddlers as human shields. They believe it is Israel's fault that Hamas is targeting and murdering civilians, indiscriminately going house by house by house. Madam President, that sentiment is sick and twisted and wrong. Now, I also worry, in addition to the knee-jerk, partisan, ideological reaction, the Biden administration also has a very real interest in dampening Israel's response, because every day the war goes on, people will ask, Israel was funded by Iran. Hamas and Hezbollah are both Iranian proxies. They work for Iran. They work under the direction of Iran, and they are funded by Iran. Without Iran, there would be no Hamas. When it was first reported that these attacks had been planned, were signed off on by the Iranian government, the usual Iran echo chamber went to work defending the regime. They said there was no evidence. And the administration and an awful lot of congressional Democrats said they weren't sure either. But you know what no one denies? You know what makes these denials so strange? No one denies that Hamas is armed, funded, and directed by Iran. The game these people are playing is they say, well, we can't be sure. We don't have video evidence. We don't have an audio recording of the Ayatollah looking at a map and telling Hamas where to breach the border fence, so we can't be sure. We have to look into it more. What utter nonsense. Why are they so defensive? Well, because since President Biden took office, this White House has been responsible for nearly $100 billion flowing to Iran. And much of that money has gone directly to Hamas and directly to Hezbollah. You know, now everyone acknowledges the $6 billion in ransom money that Joe Biden paid to get 5 Americans out of Iranian custody. I'm glad that now Democrats have joined what I and many others said was a tragic mistake that put a bounty on Americans. It set a price. $1.2 billion is what the Biden administration will pay you if you kidnap Americans. And at the time, I said more Americans will be kidnapped, and Iran will kidnap more Americans. I'm very sorry to say that prediction came true in just a matter of weeks. My Democrat colleagues would not stand with us to cut off that $6 billion when it was paid initially. Now, we have Democrats willing to do so. That's a step in the right direction. But understand the $6 billion is only the tip of the iceberg. It is only a tiny portion of the money that this administration, the Biden administration, has flooded Iran with. A few weeks before the $6 billion deal, Biden made available $10 billion related to electricity that Iran bought from Iraq, that Iraq bought from Iran. And both of those, the $16 billion, pales in comparison to the tens of billions of dollars, as much as $80 billion, that Iran has made from illicit oil sales under Biden. Understand, when Joe Biden came into office, the Iranian regime was on its knees. The economy was in shambles. Why? Because the Ayatollah gets its principal revenue from selling oil. When Donald Trump was president, I spent much of the presidency urging President Trump to vigorously enforce the oil sanctions, to cripple their oil sales. Iran had been selling 1 million barrels a day of oil. President Trump agreed with me, vigorously enforced the sanctions, and those oil sales were crushed, and the Iranian economy collapsed. That's what President Biden inherited, an Iran in shambles economically. And what did the Biden administration do? Immediately, it ceased enforcing oil sanctions. It said, in effect, sell all the oil you can, and you know what? The Ayatollah heard them. Because, Madam President, right now, Iran is selling 2 million barrels a day of oil. The same level they were selling before the sanctions ever passed, more than double what they had been selling before the vigorous enforcement of the oil sanctions under President Trump. Why is it that so many Democrat politicians hate oil and gas production in the United States, are willing to kill jobs here at home? But when it comes to theocratic, homicidal, genocidal maniacs, they're perfectly happy with letting them reap $80 billion by selling 2 million barrels a day of oil primarily to communist China. That is madness. And so let me say, I am glad the president gives speeches saying, we are standing with Israel. That's great. But actions speak louder than words. The president wants to stand with Israel. Stand up tomorrow and say, we are vigorously enforcing oil sanctions and we are going to end these oil sales. To the Democrats in this body who are giving speeches saying we stand with Israel, great. Then join me in saying we're going to take away the billions of dollars that are flooding into Iran, that are funding Hamas, that are funding the death squads, that are funding the rockets, that are funding the murder of Israelis. But it wasn't just money to Iran that went to Hamas. The Biden administration also poured money into Hamas areas directly. As soon as they came into office, the Biden administration began flooding money into the Gaza Strip. At the time, I led a coalition of 19 senators urging the Biden administration, do not send money to Gaza. Why? Because Hamas controls Gaza. And if you send hundreds of millions of dollars to Gaza, Hamas will use it to commit acts of terrorism against Israelis and Americans. At the same time that 19 of us urged the administration, don't fund Gaza because it'll fund Hamas terrorism, 145 House Democrats sent a letter to the Biden administration saying, do fund Gaza, even though it will fund Hamas terrorism. And what did the Biden administration do with these dueling letters from Congress? We now know. Because the internal government documents of the Biden administration are now public. And the Biden Treasury Department determined there was, quote, a high risk that Hamas would potentially derive benefit from the money they were sending. Now, ordinarily, that would end the matter because there are existing U.S. anti-terrorism sanctions. The laws say if you know there's a high risk it's going to terrorism, you can't send money to do it. Did the Biden administration take that step? No. Instead, they exempted themselves from American laws against funding terrorism. They wanted, as a political matter, to send the cash so much that they were willing to look the other way. To, in their own words, the, quote, high risk that that money would go to Hamas to carry out acts of terrorism. Here's the full quote from the Biden administration document. Quote, due to its overall strength and level of control over Gaza, we assess there is a high risk that Hamas could potentially derive indirect, unintentional benefit from U.S. assistance to Gaza. These atrocities in Israel were the direct result of political decisions made by the White House to dismantle pressure and to pour money into Iran and into territories controlled by Iranian terrorists. when you send billions of dollars to people who hate us and want to murder us, we should not be surprised when they use those billions of dollars to murder us. Madam President, not to support Israel in this time of need, not to support them fully for as long as it takes, would be a grave moral failure. This fight is civilization against barbarism. It is good versus evil. The differences between the two sides are as stark as light and darkness. The light and goodness, I believe, will prevail if we stand with Israel. I want to say something also. The last 2 weeks, I've spoken with many of my friends, and in particular, many of my Jewish friends. It's been astonishing, the number of my Jewish friends in Texas and all across America who have family members, who have close friends in Israel. It's been truly breathtaking, the number of American Jews I know well who either lost a loved one in these terrorist attacks or who have relatives or close friends who've been called up to the IDF, who are facing the most significant war in Israel in the last 50 years. I've spent much of the last 2 weeks reaching out to those friends and just telling them, Heidi and I are praying for you. We're lifting you up, we're lifting your family up, we're lifting the people of Israel up, encouraging them. This has been a frightening time for every Israeli and for a great many Americans. I hope that in the face of evil, we see the same solidarity we saw in the wake of September 11th. Just as the world rallied to our side when radical Islamic terrorists committed a grotesque act of terror against the United States, now is the time for the world to rally to Israel's side. And now is the time for this body to come together. There have been policy differences in the past, with some members of this body and leaders of the administration believing it's a good idea to send tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars to Iran. That policy has been proven catastrophically wrong. And so I hope that we come together and we stand as one, united, to tell the people of Israel, America stands with Israel for as long as it takes. Thank you. I yield the floor. And I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I rise today to support Senator Marshall's resolution of disapproval of this outrageous rule. You know, I have to say, as I sat here on the Senate floor, I listened to my friend from Hawaii give his floor remarks. And as I listened to what he said, I wrote down some of what he said. He said, kids need to eat. He said, don't take the food away from children. And he said, don't drag children into the culture wars. And I have to admit, Mr. President, I felt like I was in Alice in Wonderland and that I'd gone through the looking glass, because I agree emphatically with all three of those statements. And for a moment there, I thought the senator from Hawaii had risen to give a speech in support of this resolution of disapproval. What is this issue about? Understand what it is about. It is Joe Biden and the Democrats who are taking food away from children. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has told schools, we will cut off your school lunch funding. We will take the food off of your plates and out of your mouths unless the schools comply with the Biden administration's radical transgender policies. It is Joe Biden and the Democrats, and every Democrat who votes in favor of this policy, who are saying we are going to take food away from kids. Why? Because to today's Democrat Party, feeding children, and mind you, we're talking about low-income kids, many of whom the only food they get that day, they get at school. And the Democrats are going to say, we're taking away your food. Why? Because today's Democrat Party is committed to the proposition that a boy who identifies as a girl should be allowed to use the girls' restroom, should be allowed to shower with teenage girls, even if the girls don't want it. That 10, 12, 14, 15-year-old girls should be forced to shower naked next to someone who is biologically male. This is not hypothetical. Members of the Judiciary Committee listened to the testimony of Riley Gaines, a national champion swimmer who was forced, under these same idiotic policies, to shower in a shower next to someone biologically male with full male equipment. She wasn't asked for her consent. I asked the women in this chamber, how many of you would be excited to be forced to shower with someone biologically of the opposite sex? Today's Democrat Party has embraced the radical and extremes, and when it comes to sports, their view also is that boys should be able to compete against girls in sports and men should be able to compete against women in sports. And this is happening all over the country. I believe in women's sports. I believe in girls' sports. I have 2 young daughters. Sports are amazing for girls to learn discipline and hard work and teamwork. Title IX has opened doors for young women to go to college. And yet the Democrats' extreme transgender ideology is destroying girls' sports and women's sports. This is not a matter of gender or gender identity. This is a matter of fairness. Anyone who is not consumed by ideology understands there's a difference between boys and girls. There are biological differences between boys and girls. There is a reason why recently in Canadian powerlifting, a biological male won women's powerlifting, beating the second-place competitor by, if I remember correctly, 463 pounds. It is not fair to force little girls to compete against biological boys. The Democrats don't care about fairness. They care about extreme ideology, and every Democrat who votes against this CRA is voting to take the food from hungry kids, because that's how radical they are in enforcing this policy. Mr. President, I urge every senator to vote aye.
Mr. President.
Madam President.
The senator from Texas.
I call up my amendment number 1249 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Texas, Mr. Cruz, for himself, and Mr. Cornyn proposes an amendment number 1249 to amendment number 1292.
Thank you, Madam President. This is an amendment.
One moment. Under the previous order, there will now be up to 2 minutes of debate equally divided. Proceed.
Thank you, Madam President. This is an amendment that should be a simple and bipartisan common sense amendment. Under a treaty in 1944, Mexico is obliged to provide 350,000 acre-feet of water per year to the Rio Grande Valley. Farmers in the Rio Grande Valley are facing drought right now, and Mexico has been slow in meeting its treaty commitment. This amendment simply instructs the water negotiators to press Mexico to meet its treaty agreements and provide the water that is owed. I would note that the language of this amendment was worked out in a bipartisan manner and was cleared by both Democrats and Republicans on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This language was also worked out directly with the negotiators of the International Boundary and Water Commission. It's designed not to negatively impact any other state, but to instruct state to urge Mexico to meet its treaty commitments so that farmers who need water can get the water they need. And I urge members on both sides of the aisle to support the amendment.